The Boer Wars stand as one of the most fascinating, complex, and tragic chapters in Britain's colonial history. These wars were fought between the British Empire and the Boer settlers, primarily of Dutch descent, who had established themselves in the southern regions of Africa. The struggle for power, resources, and sovereignty that underpinned these conflicts sheds light on the broader themes of imperialism, resistance, and the human cost of war. Today, we're diving into the causes, events, and consequences of the Boer Wars. A story of grit, betrayal, and the struggle for freedom in the shadow of an empire. To understand the Boer Wars, we need to start with some context. The Boers, also known as Afrikaners, were descendants of Dutch settlers who had arrived in the Cape Colony in the mid-17th century. Over time, they developed a distinct identity, separate from their European roots. Their life was tough, shaped by farming on rugged terrain, conflicts with indigenous peoples, and a strong sense of independence. In 1806, the British took control of the Cape Colony during the Napoleonic Wars, marking the beginning of tensions between the Boers and the British. The British brought their own legal systems, social norms, and most controversially, their policies on slavery. In 1834, Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire, including in South Africa, angering the Boer settlers who relied on enslaved labor. This led to the Great Trek, a mass migration of Boers who left British-controlled territory in search of new lands where they could govern themselves. They established two independent republics, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, also known as the Transvaal. Initially, the British were content to leave the Boers to their own devices, but this uneasy coexistence wouldn't last. In the latter half of the 19th century, vast deposits of gold and diamonds were discovered in Boer territories, drawing international attention and triggering a wave of imperial interest. The British, driven by economic ambitions and a desire to consolidate their control over South Africa, began to encroach on Boer sovereignty. This marked the beginning of a period of escalating tensions. The First Boer War erupted in 1880, largely as a result of Britain's annexation of the Transvaal in 1877. The Boers, fiercely protective of their independence, took up arms to resist British rule. The conflict was relatively short but significant. The Boers employed guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver British forces. The war culminated in the Battle of Majuba Hill in 1881, where Boer fighters inflicted a decisive defeat on the British. Humiliated, Britain agreed to a peace settlement that recognized the independence of the Transvaal under British suzerainty. But the peace was short-lived. The discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand in the Transvaal in 1886 reignited British ambitions. Thousands of British prospectors and fortune seekers, known as Uitlanders, flocked to the region, creating a new source of tension. The Uitlanders, though numerous, were denied political rights by the Boer government, fueling resentment on both sides. British imperialists, led by figures like Cecil Rhodes, began plotting to overthrow the Boer government. In 1895, the infamous Jameson Raid, a failed coup attempt led by British forces, sought to provoke an uprising among the Uitlanders against the Boer leadership. The raid ended in disaster and only served to deepen the divide between the British and the Boers. The Transvaal, under its president Paul Kruger, formed alliances with the Orange Free State and prepared for the possibility of war. By 1899, tensions reached a breaking point. Both sides began mobilizing troops, and when negotiations failed, the Second Boer War erupted in October of that year. This conflict was far larger and more brutal than the first. The Boers initially gained the upper hand, using their well-honed guerrilla tactics to deliver a series of defeats to British forces. However, the tide began to turn when Britain poured vast resources and manpower into the war effort. Under the leadership of generals like Lord Roberts and Lord Kitchener, the British adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying Boer farms, crops, and infrastructure to deny the guerrillas supplies. They also established concentration camps where Boer civilians, including women and children, were interned under appalling conditions. These camps became notorious for their high mortality rates, with thousands dying from disease and malnutrition. The treatment of civilians shocked public opinion and remains one of the most controversial aspects of the war. Despite their resilience, the Boers were eventually worn down by Britain's overwhelming military and economic power. By 1902, the war came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging. The Boer republics were annexed into the British Empire, marking the end of their independence. However, the treaty also included provisions for the eventual self-governance of these territories, setting the stage for the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. The Boer Wars had profound and lasting consequences. For the British, the wars were a sobering reminder of the costs of imperial ambition. The use of concentration camps and the brutal tactics employed during the conflict damaged Britain's reputation on the world stage. At home, the war sparked debates about the morality of imperialism and the treatment of colonial subjects. For the Boers, the wars were both a tragedy and a turning point. They suffered enormous losses, thousands of lives, homes, and livelihoods destroyed. But their resilience in the face of overwhelming odds became a source of national pride. In the years that followed, Afrikaner nationalism grew stronger, ultimately shaping the political landscape of South Africa for much of the 20th century. The Boer Wars also had a significant impact on the indigenous African population, though their story is often overlooked. Many Africans were caught in the crossfire of the conflict, their lands and communities devastated. Some were recruited as laborers or scouts by the British, while others fought alongside the Boers. However, their contributions were largely ignored in the aftermath, and they continued to face systemic discrimination under both British and Boer rule. The wars also sparked innovations in warfare that had far-reaching consequences. For instance, the British experience with guerrilla warfare during the Boer conflict influenced military strategies in later conflicts, including World War I. The use of modern artillery, railways for troop movement, and communication technologies during the Boer Wars foreshadowed the industrialization of war in the 20th century. However, these developments came at a significant human cost. Looking back, the Boer Wars were a microcosm of the larger forces at play during the Age of Empire. They highlighted the brutal realities of colonialism, the exploitation of resources, the suppression of indigenous and settler populations, and the lengths to which imperial powers would go to maintain control. Yet they also underscored the enduring spirit of resistance among those who sought to defend their independence against seemingly insurmountable odds. Today, the legacy of the Boer Wars can still be felt in South Africa. The scars of the conflict, both physical and psychological, remain etched into the landscape and the collective memory of its people. Monuments, museums, and historical sites commemorate the bravery and sacrifices of those who fought in the wars, while debates continue about how to address the injustices of the past. The wars serve as a reminder of the complexities of history and the importance of understanding the past to navigate the challenges of the present. For modern South Africa, grappling with the legacy of colonialism and apartheid means acknowledging the pain of its history while striving for unity and reconciliation. In the end, the Boer Wars were not just a struggle between two powers, but a reflection of the human capacity for resilience, ambition, and ultimately reconciliation. They remind us that history is never simple, that the lines between hero and villain, victor and vanquished, are often blurred. And while the story of the Boer Wars may be rooted in the past, its lessons continue to resonate today. From the rugged hills of the Transvaal to the corridors of British Parliament, the Boer Wars tell a tale of ambition clashing with identity, of empires battling over the wealth of nations, and of the people caught in between. It's a story worth remembering, not just for what it teaches us about history, but for what it reveals about humanity itself.